Okay, I'm Beth McCarthy from Toucan Protocol, and I'm speaking about building regenerative culture today. So to kind of start off with what I mean by that, then I want to go into what I mean when speaking about a regenerative organization. So, those of us in the refi space, have had a lot of discourse going around about what is regenerative about what we are doing, is some definitions being like specifically using decentralized finance mechanisms for climate impact or, public goods funding, or kind of intentionally building into regenerative practices like circular economics. But I am also super interested in this greater examination that comes from working in a regenerative space, specifically about how we can make organizations that are nourishing for people, and in this environment where we are continually having to adapt to changes in regulation, to changes in the market, to DAO drama that causes people to switch a lot between projects, and just a general attitude in the space about wanting to be fulfilled that often comes into conflict with libertarian policies and kind of pervasive politics in the space. I want to speak briefly about how I personally define a regenerative organization. So number one that's resilient and anti-fragile. So intentionally thinking about how to be sustainable over time. So that would mean through different phases and cycles of, different types of contributors coming in, different market conditions, decentralizing to a DAO, encountering any of these circumstances of change, instead of, breaking as it goes into a next season, intentionally building a resilient structure. Also, an organization that is ethical, so having a really specific idea and, that's discussed in an explicit manner, that is set with leadership team or with, core contributors, and also input and, as part of a discourse between other contributors and team members, between, what actually matters, to our organization, if we are trying to have diversity and inclusion initiatives, for example, what does that actually mean, not only in terms of hiring practices and percentages, but also how people are treated within the company, both in internal Slack messages, but also in attitudes toward things like parental leave, and really explicitly defining these values and encoding them into the infrastructure of the org through policies, standards, and practices, that are actually lived and returned to and examined. And that leads into this other aspect of being iterative. So having really rigorous self-examination of, what is the cultural state of our organization? Are we intentionally setting culture, and then revising that as we scale, as we're existing in different conditions, and having a really quantifiable and qualifiable process that's able to be revisited over time, able to scale, and accessible to other people who are in the organization or in the ecosystem, so that this, so that the ethical can be explicit and expanded upon. So regenerative organizations bring this feedback loop of self-awareness across these multiple dimensions. So cultural, technical, ecological, economic. I'm sure there's many others, but these are the ones that I've been interested in recently. And specifically thinking about this functioning system. So, the both the team that you're in and also the greater system of builders, because, as we can all see, seeing all of our friends out in the hallway, seeing projects that, have these composable pieces that tie into each other. We're all super interconnected in this space, and a lack of meeting any of these ethical, iterative, sustainable dimensions ends up reverberating out through the rest of the system that we are operating in. And I think it's really useful to characterize gaps or blockages or unacknowledged patterns and anti-patterns within the system as debt, so time and resources borrowed from the system, to continue pushing it forward, but in, a way that is not necessarily examined or being rigorously measured and revisited. So specifically with this concept of technical debt that I'm sure, most people here are familiar with. So I really like this concept. So a quote from the guy who came up with the concept, you can make these sacrifices of not doing code documentation, doing things sloppily and not explaining to others why that happened. A tweet that I thought was really valuable and was going to include in this and forgot until now was it said the hardest thing about working on a technical team is not necessarily the actual technical challenges, but understanding why we did this, who decided to do that, so you can ask them, and then that person is no longer there or on holiday all the time because they were one of the OJ people that came up with it. And this lack of thinking about how choices that are made, will impact stuff down the line, and having documentation and also having communication, with others who are impacted by it, would be characterized as technical debt. So then this other guy, Martin Fowler, made a really cool diagram for this. So thinking in this context, some debt is incurred through deliberate choices, some through inadvertent or accidental choices, and some of those might be reckless, some would be people are really trying to do the right thing and proceed prudently, but it still ends up having a negative impact. So just to conceptualize these, so deliberate and reckless, we don't have time for design, a major one that I have personally witnessed in my many years working with emerging startups, being we don't have time to make a design system, we don't have time to have clear communication pathways between design and marketing and product, we aren't going to do user research because we need to push this forward. So a deliberate and reckless choice, another one being just people not having time to all learn and be educated about what their tech stack is like, deliberate and prudent, having to make the choice between going ahead and shipping and something still being a mess and being we'll come back and fix that later, and, inadvertent and prudent, what is it called? Afterthought being 2020, realizing, okay, we made this mistake, and really the only way for us to have understood that that was a mistake and the parameters of that mistake was to make it, and so then you can do with that choice what you will. So I think it's really useful to take this concept of technical debt and extrapolate it to thinking about culture. So, by culture, I mean team culture within a DAO or project, but also, cultural choices that impact everyone in your community or ecosystem. Okay, cool. So, examples that we all have experienced, trying out or transitioning to a new structure like a DAO without thinking through the consequences. So, it was interesting yesterday in one of the talks I was hearing, some people who were deeply involved with kind of getting DeFi DAOs off the ground being now this is running away with us, there's messy product decisions, there's poor decision-making structures, and, as with this bottom right, bottom left, I'm kind of dyslexic, this quadrant, then, they, just not realizing these things are problems until later. And also, some of these things, though, can be nipped in the bud in terms of like, if your team or project is lacking self-awareness about issues such as lack of diversity, unclear communication, distrust within teams, and still choosing not to acknowledge that, or not to, undergo conflict resolution practices, or to think intentionally about that, these anti-patterns, then become what your culture is, and your culture is one where, things are happening like, autonomy bottlenecks because it has not quite been thought through, what is the decision-making structure? How does that impact people in different teams? So, as you can see, I really like this quadrant and think that it's super useful to think about these parameters of cultural debt. So, just to run through these quickly, and I wish that I was better at perceiving time, because I was hoping to ask if anyone else had any other examples, but I am about to end, I think. But, please, mention in the question section if you have other thoughts that fit in here, because I think they're, some of these, like, it seems like it would be positive on its face, especially some of these inadvertent ones that happen, such as like, we are all suffering from this endemic burnout throughout our system, but then, people constantly putting in work, ends up being praised because people are doing incredible stuff, and like, there needs to be an understanding, that this is part of a debt structure, taking from people's potential future time and ability by getting so burnt out. Similarly, exploring flat hierarchies and decentralized organizations and going through those pain points, but then, having it be like, well, I don't know who set the budget, I don't know who to ask about this, and people, not wanting to claim authority because, we're trying to be flat and decentralized, but then, there ends up being a lack of autonomy because there's no one just signing off on that decision. And then, I would say a deliberate one could be an example of, projects that very intentionally adopt a hard libertarian stance and, don't want to have a nourishing or regenerative culture because that's, what suits their way of operating. But, obviously that's creating cultural debt, and that's, a very intentional choice. And similarly with deliberate and prudent, a lot of times, discussions, I'll close in like 1 second. Yeah, discussions we end up happening in the DAO space where it's like, I love working in that space, but, I have to be a contractor to work with the DAO, so I can't get sponsored for a visa, or I can't have health insurance, or I can't have parental leave, and I want to start a family. And like, I think we lose a lot of talent by people having to weigh, the policies that are very intentionally chosen for good reasons by DAOs around liability and around, this decentralized ethos, yet it ends up having these reverberations. So I just think, super important to consider, and I don't have time to talk about this, but, working in the climate action space, like, there's also considerations about ecological debt that has to be weighed against cultural debt, especially for things like, just to highlight this one quadrant, flying teams all around the world is so important for cultural cohesion, but leads to, carbon emissions and all of this stuff. So I think, we need to think about all of these like elements of the framework, existing in proportion to each other for how to operate sustainably, ethically, and like iteratively. So, yeah. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, we can go to the question part. Does anybody has one? Thank you very much.